welcome everyone to today's Schwartz Center Compassion in Action webinar, Building Trust in Complex Environments. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Julie Collier, Senior Director of Programs here at the Schwartz Center. As many of you know, we are a Boston-based nonprofit organization established in 1995 to advance compassion in healthcare. Our vision at the Schwartz Center is that everyone who gives and receives care experiences compassion. We are glad you have joined us today for what I'm sure will be an informative session with Ron Carucci, a renowned leadership and organizational change consultant. Ron will be sharing his research and insights into cultivating trust and trustworthiness in organizations. Before we start, I'd like to share a few details about what you can expect. Please note that the program will last 60 minutes with a presentation for the first 35 or 40 minutes or so, followed by some time for questions. Feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A pane throughout the discussion. I'd also like to acknowledge with gratitude that this Compassion in Action webinar series has been funded in part by a generous donation made in memory of Julian and Eunice Cohen. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Beth Lown, Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and Chief Medical Officer of the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare. And I know she's excited to get this conversation started.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I am very, very excited to introduce you to our guest today, Ron Carucci. Ron is co-founder and managing partner at Navalent, working with CEOs and executives, pursuing transformational change for their organizations, leaders, industries, and he has a 30-year track record helping executives tackle challenges of strategy and organizational leadership. Ron is also participating as a guest expert for our Healing Healthcare initiative this year. And I highly recommend his book, which is how I found Ron in the first place, to be honest, Lead with the Power of Truth, Justice, and Purpose. This is it's a translation of his 15 years of research, and it's an excellent reflection on trust and trustworthiness. So with that, I will pass this off to you, Ron. Looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Beth. I really appreciate that. And thanks for having me today. It's a real privilege. And thank you to our 215 healthcare workers from all over the place. I've really been enjoyed reading your answers in the chat and seeing all the different ways you think about trust and trustworthiness and how you earn it. And it looks as though listening gets our top vote today in terms of how it is we make sure others can trust us. Let me start by offering a deep, heartfelt thank you to all of you for the work you do, for the sacrifices you make, for the unsung heroism you offer the world. I know from my own research, both in trustworthiness and also in my experiences in healthcare, that these are tough times for you all. And you have my personal gratitude for all the ways you suffer in ways we don't see, so that those who you're caring for can suffer less. And your incredible sacrifices and talents and passion and care are not, with me, not unnoticed. I hope today is a great conversation with each of you. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and sharing with you a little bit about what I've learned when it comes to trustworthiness. So I'm going to share my screen and get going in the conversation. Here, let me one of the things that's really interesting to me today about this conversation, especially in your world, is I did a bunch of research earlier last year on moral injury. I know that's a concept you're painfully familiar with, and its intense increase in healthcare. And the relationship between the trauma response to having to compromise my own principles and trustworthiness and what it does to that. I've been also fascinated to see the very complicated correlation between trust in the healthcare system and trust within the healthcare system, and how those two things painfully relate to one another. As we continue to add technology and AI and data to healthcare delivery systems, complexity is only going to proliferate. And the bottom line reality is that there's no way to decomplexify healthcare. But what you can do is add trust. The only real antidote what we know from the social sciences and organizational sciences is the commensurate degree of complexity needs to be met with a commensurate degree of trust, which is often difficult to establish. If you look at why this conversation becomes important today, it's a grim landscape. You have 50% of 54% of organizations have experienced a material drop in trust. We have huge disengaged populations. Half of the workforce not being able to find meaning and purpose in their work, and institutional trust being at an all-time low. It can be bleak, but what I wanted to do in my research was find out under what conditions will people behave in a trustworthy way, and under what conditions will they go to the dark side. Could we predict what would happen in certain environments? And if we could predict it, could we shape environments more conducive to establishing trustworthiness and less that bring us to our dark sides? What we learned in the research is that trustworthiness is a collection of both in our neurosciences, but also in the social sciences, is a collection of telling the truth, justice, doing the right thing fairly, and serving a greater good. Truth, justice, and purpose. Do the right thing, say the right thing, and do and say the right thing for the right reason. To be labeled trustworthy, we learned that you actually have to do all three. And if you do one or two of them, you might get labeled as reliable or caring or good-hearted. But because we are today living in a trust recession, the bar on trustworthiness has gone up that much higher. And what that means is that it's much harder to earn and keep the trust of others than we once thought and that it once was. I know among your organizations, there are constant stressors on trust, resource stresses, role stresses, relationship stresses between the classic divisions between nursing and doctors and administrators and departments, between therapeutic areas and in the OR. All kinds of places where at the seams of the organization, trust can erode. What I want us to think about today, and if you sort of read through the chat responses, I think you begin to see this emerge among your answers, is that trust is a currency. We all trade in a different economy. Some of us trade in character, some of us trade in competence, some of us trade in personality, some of us trade in different levels of care. Do I know that you care before I trust you? Some of us extend it based on similarities. Do I feel like you're enough like me? And so trust is extended directly proportional to the degree of respect and inclusion and care that I receive. But over time, our biases create calluses on our trust, our ability to extend trust, and our impulse to withhold it. I think today, we often start with an impulse to withhold trust versus extend it, because our experience has told us that we're more likely to have our trust betrayed than we are to have it honored. We interviewed more than 3,200 leaders over a 15-year longitudinal study to see if we could predict what conditions create trustworthiness. And we found that there are 4. And I'm going to share my findings with you today. And my hope is that those of you in roles where you can shape the environment around you, that you can begin to think about, are you aiming your efforts at the right places? I don't think there's a healthcare leader in the world that wouldn't want an environment more conducive to trust and care and engagement and inclusion. But what I often see is efforts, lots of excessive efforts being extended, but not at the things that actually induce trust. For those of you not in those roles, what I hope is that this makes you want to think about what does grace mean for you? How do you extend or withhold trust to those? Whether they, on what basis are you deciding to extend or withhold trust? So the first condition we found was a clear, consistent identity. Be who you say you are. Actions and words matching. Transparent decision-making. Honest conversations that lead to transparent choices. Fairness and justice and accountability, meaning my contributions are treated with dignity first. And lastly, a big one in your world, cross-functional collaboration. everyone feels connected to a bigger story. I'm going to unpack each of these for you, and then we'll take a look at what they look like in action and give you some thoughts on how you can put them into practice. So all our organizations have mission statements, we have purpose statements. Each of us comes to the workplace with a set of values. Sometimes we make those known. What we saw in the data was that when a consistent identity is present, you're 3 times more likely to have people trust you. In other words, tell the truth, behave fairly, and serve a greater good. But when your actions and words don't match, when there's a say-do gap, you're 3 times more likely to have people withhold trust. When I walk into a room, commonly referred to as a meeting, and I see what's happening in the room is an honest exchange of ideas. There's no agenda to manipulate me to think a certain way. And I feel welcome to offer a different point of view and perhaps the one that's prevailing. You're 3.5 times more likely to have me be honest because I trust the transparency of what's happening. But if I walk into that room and I think it's something more than orchestrated theater, that it's a performance, and your goal is to get me to nod in a certain direction and to agree with what's being said. And the last thing I think you want to hear is a different point of view for me. Now you're 3.5 times more likely to lose my trust because I know that to get the truth, I have to go underground. When my contribution is treated fairly, in other words, when I believe that there's a level playing field for success, that I can actually have as much of a chance of being successful as anybody else here, and when I feel like I'm treated with dignity. Today, our workplaces, especially in healthcare, our contributions are closely connected to the contributor. What you are offering is your care, your compassion, your ideas, your diagnosis, your analysis, your pattern recognition. You are the contribution. It's not like, in days gone by, it was how many cases did you close? How many files did you process? How many things did you print? It was sort of a much more of a production mindset. But today, accountability, when you rate or evaluate the contributor, you're also contribution, you're also evaluating the contributor. So if I feel like my work is being talked about with dignity, you're 4 times more likely to earn my trust. But if I feel like a cog in your wheel, if I feel like I'm just another number, if I feel like the contribution is being talked about as if it's not me as the contributor, you're 4 times more likely to have me distrust you. And lastly, the biggest multiplier in our research of surprise was cross-functional cohesion. So at the seams of the organization, administration and medical and nursing and administration, cardiology and the OR, operations and the labs. Pick any seam you want. If the natural tensions and the natural conflicts that would happen at those seams are handled well, if those folks can come together and be part of a bigger story, they understand the value they create together, and that relationship is strong, you are 6 times more likely to have people trust each other. But if those fragments create silos, if they create we-they thinking, if people at those seams don't trust the people on the other side of it, and the goal is no longer to find a single source of truth, but to prove you wrong and me right, now you're 6 times more likely to have people be dishonest and be untrustworthy. Cumulatively, if you do all 4 of these things well, you are increasing your trustworthiness factor by a quotient of 16 times. But if you stink at all 4 of these things, you are 16 times more likely to have a distrustful or a gross lack of trust in your environment. So let's talk about what they mean. So being who you say you are. Do you embody your stated values? When you have a say-do gap, when you make a mistake, when you live differently than what you say is important to you, do you own it? Do the people in the organization understand their contribution to the greater purpose? And in your case, in all of your cases, you're all part of saving lives and enhancing human health. Does everybody from the janitor on up understand and feel part of that story? Or do they feel like it's classist, that there are, rankings and levels of importance, and what people say, their lived experience of the values is different than the words. Wonderful case study we found in our research was when Hubert Joly took over Best Buy. One of the things he did was he could have just closed all the stores. They were losing all kinds of performance to Amazon and on retailers, and conventional wisdom said close all the stores, cut costs. But he decided to rehumanize the organization. He went around and he listened. So I look at the word listening and how often it appears in your chat today. He listened to those employees. He cared about their needs. He asked them when they were at their best. He asked what story they thought they were living, and he actually made dramatic changes based on what he heard from those employees. And his goal was to connect everybody's individual purpose to the broader purpose of enhancing lives through technology, which is what became the rallying cry of their mission. The share price dramatically skyrocketed while he led that organization, and employee retention increased, turnover decreased, and the people that work there felt part of a bigger story. Hubert is a beautiful example of the kind of leader we'd all love to have as our boss, because he cared, and his goal was to unleash the human magic. And he said, before we're anything else, we're humans, and he wanted that to be what he led with. So how can we all, be who we say we are? Ask your colleagues, what do you believe I value? Leaders, if you have a team of folks that you are responsible for, ask them what they believe you value. Bring the mission statement or the purpose statement or the values off the wall and put them on the table in your staff and say, hey, how are we doing living by these? Leaders, ask yourself this. If a video camera followed your team around all day long and videoed a day in the life of your team, could that video be used to train people on how to behave in your values? And lastly, clarify the greater purpose you want to serve. You are all there in the service of saving lives. You all trained for the work you do because you care about human life. You care about the health and well-being of people. But on really hard days, it's very difficult when you're tired, when you're burned out, when you're exhausted, to keep hold of that purpose. How do you refresh that for yourself? How do you and your colleagues keep that purpose alive and well? We know from the last several years that you don't hold back in your giving, but are you replenishing it? And how do you do that to keep that purpose alive? Accountability. Are contributions perceived to be fairly assessed when you sit with each other, when you sit with those who lead you or those you lead? Do people feel like the work that you're talking about is being honored with dignity? Can we talk about, is failure acceptable, or do people have to hide their mistakes? Is dignity the core of the conversation? I know the last couple of years have put incredible strain on your organizations. And leaders, hear me well. What your organizations are starved for is to know they matter, is to know that their work is believed in. So if the efforts you're making to increase engagement, to increase cohesion, to enhance a sense of belonging are not aimed at restoring and strengthening dignity, then they're probably not going to have the outcomes you want. What we know from our neuroscience is that we have a lot more control over dignity than we might have thought. What neuroscientists have learned is that the part of our brain that regulates self-esteem is a neural pathway that connects the part of our brain that controls self-knowledge to the part of our brain that controls motivation and reward. So the stronger that pathway is, the stronger someone's self-esteem. That pathway is also strongly influenced by what others think of us. So I was working with a client recently, a healthcare executive, who was on a succession plan to take a much bigger role in the next year, was seen as a very high potential leader. And we had scheduled our coaching session to be right after his performance appraisal because we knew it was coming. after the year we'd worked together, and we just wanted to debrief. Well, he came on the screen, and I could immediately see the veins bulging out of his neck, and he was like incensed. And he said, "She gave me a 3. I'm always a 4, but now I'm a 3 because HR says there's a quota. Who got the 4s?" He was irrationally irate over this rating he'd been given. And so I said, "Tim, can you send me the documents? I want to read them." I was trying to figure out how to help him regulate. And I was quickly reading through the document to see if I was expecting to see all kinds of words of demeaning, demoralizing, disrespectful, things that would have made him feel so badly. But what I read was actually quite fair. It was kind. It was balanced. The things that he had done well were talked about honorably. The things that he needed to improve on were known and were talked about with positive intent. But it was the number. And it turns out, what we know from categorical thinking is when humans get placed in a category, in a box, we feel invisible. We feel threatened. And so Tim's amygdala was just reacting as it was trained to react, which is, you put me in a box. Even if he'd gotten the 4, he might have still been triggered. So we have got to make sure we're not labeling each other. We're not biasing each other. We're not putting targets on each other's backs by calling us the difficult one, or the weak one, or the angry one, or the aloof one, or the 2. We have to make sure that we are rehumanizing how we see each other, even on the days we piss each other off, which is hard to do. But that's how you create an environment of dignity. So who are the people you most rely on? Who are the stakeholders in your organization that on whom your success depends, and their success depends on you? And how are those relationships? Where do you have perhaps ripples where you need to sort of maybe strengthen those relationships? Where are there injustices? Where are there places where other people have not had a chance to shine, or had a chance to try their hand at something new, or to contribute and be honored for it? Make sure people understand and have an opportunity to feel like their contribution matters, and make sure the psychological safety is there, people to own their mistakes. I know that in your world, that's a difficult thing to do, but there's plenty of research that shows, especially in healthcare, that psychological safety is powerful when people can talk freely about the things that don't go well. Transparency. Can people predict your reactions? Can people predict how you'll make choices? Leaders, can they decode your decision-making apparatus? When you have meetings together, are those meetings safe places to tell the truth? Are people raising tough issues? Are people engaging in challenging conversations, and are they free to disagree? Or is it theater? Are people just coming in and going around the table and saying what they want to hear? If your meetings, if the conversations you have among your teams are not balanced with honest exchanges, that means that honesty is going somewhere else. So if they're not telling you what needs to be said in the room, where are they telling it? Decisions need to be transparent. People don't need to agree with their decisions, but they need to understand how they were made. And so if you're part of decision-making structures, you need to be certain that when you make choices, especially ones that are going to disappoint people or frustrate people, that you are transparent about how that decision was made and why. Do you invite dissent? Are you offering dissent? When you have a voice to say, do you tell yourself, why bother, what's the point? Or do you offer a constructive point of view that can help make things better? Are people skilled at resolving conflict? Have you built your muscles to be able to handle differences and exchanges that are emotional sometimes? How do you determine what information you share and what information you don't? Transparency is a huge determinant of whether or not people can trust the environment. People are so afraid that I'll share information that people don't like. Whether or not people like it is not typically a determinant of trust. It's whether or not they believe it. And so if you're not sharing information, people are going to make up stories in their head. And so don't determine your level of transparency based on whether you're going to make people happy, because that's going to set you up to be untrusted. And lastly, how are your relationships across borders? Are you, do you work with those you have to collaborate with or coordinate with in other departments? When you see them in your caller ID, do you think, oh God, what do they want? Who is your they? Who is the department that sends you over the edge, makes you crazy, frustrates you to no end? Who's they or you? Who is the person that sees you in their caller ID and wants to run the other way? All of us have those border wars. Where can you make those relationships stronger? Over what seam in your organization could you build a better bridge to make sure that people want to work with you, that people feel like you have their success at heart? It can be very difficult and very natural in complex environments like healthcare to want to hunker down and focus on your team, your work, your silo. But the reality is everything in a healthcare system is interdependent. There's not one thing any one group does that doesn't affect some other group. And so think about the places where you have to coordinate across groups and departments. Where could those seams be stronger? Where could those relationships be more understanding, more compassionate, more caring? You may be thinking, well, I'm doing my part, it's them that's the problem. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe reach out across and have the courage to say to a colleague, how can we do this better? How can we make this relationship stronger for all of us? And you might surprise yourself. What we know about belonging in the workplace, what we know about making sure people feel a sense of hospitality and welcome to other departments, to each other, is that you see dramatic job when belonging is genuine, when I really know I fit, I don't have to hide myself, I'm welcomed. You have 56% improvement in performance, and half turnovers cut by half. If people with a strong sense of belonging report a 56% higher rate of satisfaction. One incident of micro-exclusion can decrease an individual's contribution on a team by 25%. One incident. And micro-exclusions can include just being ignored, not being asked, how are you? In an environment characterized by so much depletion, replenishment of care, replenishment of regard, replenishment of hospitality. The root of hospitality, is that much more critical. In a 10,000 person company, if every person felt a sense of belonging, that's $52 million in a boosted productivity. Think about the cost of people showing up every day and not feeling welcomed by you, no matter what your job is. And sometimes we get so tired and exhausted and frustrated that we don't realize we're being inhospitable to others. Sometimes the best way to replenish our own sense of belonging is to make sure we reach out to others. And that may sound counterintuitive, but it's true. Our own sense of well-being is often bolstered when we help others. And not, I don't mean in your case patients, but I mean your colleagues. In my research, I wanted to find stories of people who really belied the notion of crossing boundaries and reaching out to others and reaching out to be part of a relationship that was their they. And in my process, I met these two amazing gentlemen. This is Malachi and Roberto, but they're known as News and Spank. Those are their gang names. They grew up in Compton, California, and they were each part of notorious rival gangs, the Crips and the Bloods. Now, if you know anything about gang stories or warfare, you know that these two gangs notoriously lethal, that you could get killed for just wearing another gang's colors. They should have never been friends. By all statistics, they should have not even survived. They grew up around drugs, prostitution. They were in and out of jail in their early formative years. They each experienced the death of close friends to gang warfare when they were young. And they both were in and out of jail in their formative years. One day, Spank decided to enroll in culinary school, of all places to learn. And the two of them who they should have never formed an alliance, decided to start a business together. And at first, they would cook in their mother's kitchens and their grandmother's kitchens. And because News had such a great Instagram following, because he used to sell drugs, he would post pictures of their food on Instagram. And when they did, lines would form around the block to come and get it. In fact, once the cops came, thinking that they were selling drugs, the neighborhood nicknamed them Trap Kitchen. But rather than being named after a trap house that sold drugs, they decided that trap stood for take risks and prosper. In my interview with them, they told me we could have just as easily ended up as enemies, but we chose to be friends. We decided not to see all the ways the world told us we were different, or that our gang should keep us apart. So I think if they can come together and make a they part of their we, the rest of us can do better too. So who is your they? Who could you make part of your we? Who have you decided is not worthy of your grace or forgiveness, or has lost your trust? Where there's weak cross-functional ties, can you stitch a seam? Where can you build common ground? Sometimes we think that common ground means I'm going to have to compromise what I believe, but it's not. We can not have to see the world the same way to be in productive, trusting relationship. And where can you get better at conflict? Where can you get better at managing those differences so they don't wreck relationships? So one of the most moving stories I found in my research was this one. This is Manuel Mar-Yolanda. He, in 1963, started the Armed Forces of Colombia, what became the Communist Party of Colombia. A ruthless organization. It began to under the guise of caring for the rural poor in Colombia against the communist regime and against the interests of the impoverished farmers. But as the battle raged on quickly in the early 60s, they were outnumbered, and FARC members had to retreat to the jungles and the countrysides of Colombia to live. Over the next 50 years, more than 200,000 people died in the bloodbath of war between the FARC and the Colombian government. 30% of those estimated to be children. It's considered the largest single internally displacement of people in history. In 2016, the Colombian government decided to sign a peace, finally negotiate peace with FARC and create a ceasefire. The problem was, at that point, there were still 18,000 members of FARC living in the countryside in the jungles of Colombia. Where do they go? It wasn't like the members of Colombian citizens were ready to welcome them back into mainstream society. But this man, Ami Gongora, who worked at the University of Sydney, a native Colombian, also an environmental scientist, had an idea. He knew that the jungles and the rainforests of Colombia were vastly unexplored territories, that environmental bioscientists were eager to go study unexplored species of plants and animals, unexplored species of insects, sources of medicinal and food that were there. And he thought, who better to be able to, ecotourism was another major opportunity waiting to happen there. Who better to become the people who know that world than those who have lived there for 30, 40 years? So he started a program called Peace with Nature. It was a training program to train 100 former combatants at a time to be citizen environmentalists, ecotourism guides. And in some of those workshops, there were even members of the military and police that they had fought against. He said in an interview, he never imagined environmental science acting as a source of redemption. I think all of our organizations can learn something from this story. We all have people living in the far hinterlands of our organizations waiting to be welcomed back, whose stories need to be redeemed. Here were 18,000 people who had been excommunicated, had been no longer part of society, and an environment they lived in vastly needed to explore. It took a vision like Jaime's to see counterintuitively how those two things could come together. I think our organizations are littered with stories of individuals who've been outcast, who've been told they don't belong, who've been told they have nothing to contribute, who've been vilified for something. How do we redeem their stories? How do we turn those stories around and make them they part of our we? Make the people we've decided are no longer worthy of being here with a wonderful place to contribute. Every day, every one of us shows up at work looking to answer two fundamental questions. Do I matter? And do I belong? What if in our presence, no matter who we are, what if in our presence, those we interact with never doubted that the answer to both those questions was an unqualified yes? Because when anybody doubts that the answer is yes to those questions, they go about settling for the counterfeit, looking like I matter and looking like I belong. And we all know what it's like when someone decides to perform their importance or muscle their way into their belonging. It's terrible. So what do we have to do to create environments where each of us, no matter where we sit, no matter what our role is, can establish an environment where nobody in my presence wonders whether they matter or they belong? I think that is the fundamental of establishing trust in our organizations, is that when people come in my presence, whether I'm a leader or an individual contributor or whatever my role is, nobody wonders. Even if I don't like you, you don't doubt that you matter or belong in my presence. What it takes to make that happen, and what it's going to take to get change to happen in your industry, is hope. We have a lot of restoration of trust to create in the healthcare world, among you and between you. And I don't profess that that's going to be easy, but for your sakes, especially, but certainly for the patients you serve, it's vital that we figure out a way back to each other. Years ago in the early 90s, doctors in Sweden discovered a phenomenal and strange condition in children that were asylum seeking from the Eastern Bloc countries, from the former Soviet nations. As they entered Sweden, all their asylum was not guaranteed. And children who had seen horrific atrocities where they came from, as their fear of being sent back increased, they began to strangely shut down. They would stop eating, they would stop playing, in some cases they would stop speaking, and eventually they would slip into what could only be described as a comatose state. Their bodily functions were all healthy and fine. They had to be tube fed and diapered, but they were, for all intents and purposes, comatose. There was no medical explanation for this. Some of those children stayed that way for more than 18 months. The moment their asylum was assured, meaning their families, their parents had been granted safety, they began to wake up. And over several months would return to normal functioning. They would talk, they would eat, they would play. Doctors named this resignation syndrome. And they said that the antidote for it was hope. I wonder how many of our organizations have versions of resignation syndrome where people have quit and stayed, where people have checked out. Our employee engagements are low because people have lost hope. Hope is most needed when the evidence for it is least available. And so my hope for you today is that you can find new sources of hope in each other. That you decide to be sources of hope to each other, especially those of you who are leaders and are in positions of power and authority to create the hope needed to bring healthcare back to the places where people love and want to be there. You are amazingly dedicated professionals. You have given so much of yourselves. The last several years have taken from you more than any of us will understand. But I believe hope is the way back to the trust we all want there. And I hope today that I've given you some ideas to think about that might restore a little bit of that hope for you. Stay in touch. You can check out the website. If you want to meet some of the wonderful heroes that I met, To Be Honest is a book of heroes that Beth mentioned before. And you can, at the tobehonest.net, we videoed all the interviews I did, so you can meet all the wonderful leaders and see what they had to say in a TV series was a news magazine show we called Moments of Truth. There's also a free assessment you can download called How Honest Is My Team? So if you really want to assess how much of a skinny your team's getting, you can go evaluate that. So please take advantage of those resources. And thank you so much today for having me. And I'm going to open it up for any questions or thoughts you have. I see a bunch of stuff in the chat and the QA, so let's start there.
Thank you so much, Ron. I love the stories, and I'm leaving with all kinds of things in my mind to remind me, about how to be trustworthy myself. There are some questions, and so I guess I will start with with some of them, but you're getting a lot of thanks in the chat, so I just want to give you a heads up about that.
Thanks.
Also, we will make a recording of this. All of our webinars are archived on our website under the Compassion Action webinar tab, so should be up shortly, probably at the beginning of next week. In terms of the Q&A, so here's the first question in there. How can organizations make dignity the core of performance management and measurement? Let's do that one first before we get to the next.
I love the term. I mean, I love the term because I hate it. Value-based care, because it has a false sense of objectivity in it. The reality is that accountability is an act of care. A lot of leaders assume that care and accountability are opposing forces. They're not. Actually, I have a whole course on LinkedIn Learning on how to show care while holding people accountable. And dignity becomes the core of that conversation the minute I, as the leader, ask you, how are you doing? How do you feel things are going? When the determinant of evaluation starts with your assessment of it, not mine. Sure, I have to give you my views. I have to create a way to evaluate your work that you and I should have agreed to at the very beginning of the year. But if you walk out of that conversation feeling like your work was honored, that the places where you may have fallen short were talked about with respect, and we together found ways to close those gaps, and you walked out feeling good about it, it worked. If you walk out of that meeting thinking about my behavior and how I said what I said, how I spoke, how you felt unseen and unknown and disregarded, it didn't work. And so at the end of the day, we have got to create performance systems that put humanity back into the mix. Objectively managing performance is a fool's errand. Because, I mean, yes, there are objective standards, but again, none of your jobs are devoid of you. You're, as nurses, as doctors, as lab technicians, as anything you do, requires your analysis, your ideas, your creativity, your judgment, your courage. Your contribution is a reflection of you. So to say that when I talk to you about that, I'm not talking about you, is foolish. And if I do that in a way that takes you out of it to just try and talk about the work, that's disrespectful. So I hope leaders would learn that the first thing to reinsert is humanity. And to realize that the work you're talking about came as a direct emanation of a human being.
So interesting. So it's really person-centered feedback, One person mentioned, just sticking with qualitative comments and feedback. And my guess is you're saying yes to that.
We listen, thank you, Lisa, for asking the question. Lisa, Greg. We have decades of research that shows that categorical thinking, numbers, ratings are useless. They provide no value. They do not enhance the quality of decision-making. They do not allocate compensation resources any better than without them. They are a comforting tool for leaders. They create a false sense of objectivity, and they are shown to be incredibly biased. So my personal opinion is that they're useless. Now, to take them away means we need leaders who can exercise judgment. We need leaders who are courageous. We need leaders who understand how to evaluate human behavior and human performance, and to have those conversations. Yep, that means the bar on leaders has gone up. That's why they pay you more. We have used numerical systems to hide leaders' shortfalls. That's all they've done.
Well, that's helpful and interesting, and suggests a very transformative, pathway to move forward. You raised some interesting things, though, about that made me think of reflective supervision, which is a common thing amongst mental health, behavioral health folks. They get reflective supervision around their therapy or their counseling. And it's not something that we have in place necessarily in healthcare. But it brings me to this level of middle management.
Yeah.
And that sort of hidden next layer down from the C-suite in terms of setting the climate for trust in a unit, a department, or a healthcare facility. Can you talk a little bit more about their role and suggestions for that?
So Tara, thank you for putting that. She just put the question in the thing about middle managers. So it's wonderful, great timing. So we think of organizations in multiple nested systems, right? So think about a pipe with three things. So you have the strategic system, which is the top of the house that's thinking about the future. That's thinking about the external competitive environment or the regulatory environment. You have the middle system we call the coordinating system, and then you have the core of that piping, the operational system, the executional thing. Middle managers have the toughest job in that system. The coordinating system is one, it translates the strategy and the vision into daily direction and operational actions for the operational layer. But they have the greatest responsibility for peripheral vision, because that's where coordination across the system happens. So you not only have to manage vertically, you have to manage horizontally. Where I think most middle managers default to is the vertical, because that just our understanding of hierarchy, our understanding of organizations makes us think that way. But where I push middle managers always is to if you have to let one of them go, let the vertical one go. If you focus on strengthening the horizontal relationships at the seams, to your left and to your right, how you're translating things this way, you actually would become more empowering to the operational layer, and you become less scrutinized by the strategic layer. Because you're often being asked to do things. Now, a lot of times what happens at the strategic system is they create compression. They squeeze that pipe because they're reaching down and they're doing the work of the coordinating system. And so they create this decision compression, which is what you're talking about when you feel like you have no control over the changes. But part of what gives you greater control is when you know the end-to-end value chain of the system. So you understand the entire healthcare delivery and your relationships between departments, between administration, medical, nursing, operation, OR, scheduling, all the places. If you understand can strengthen the spinal cord, you have that much more influence up, because you will have knowledge that the strategic system doesn't have. And they will have less inclination to wanting to meddle. So think about the vertical and horizontal axis in which you have to operate, which is what makes middle management that much harder, and really lean into that horizontal axis more. It's counterintuitive, but that's where I see middle management become more empowered and stronger. It's because they lean peripherally, not vertically.
That's so interesting. And yet, there is this issue where there seems to be, sort of invisible barriers between executive, administrative leadership, the next level down, middle management, and then the front lines. And, like it or not, we are very, very hierarchical, in healthcare. And
what's so sad about that, Beth, is that there's nothing vertical about what you do. Nothing.
True enough. That's absolutely true. Not clinically at all. And yet the decisions are made that way.
Right, which is what makes them so painful.
Vertically and then translated down.
Right.
And that really, impairs trust in the development of trust.
And if you look at the healthcare systems that get written up in the journals all the time, Intermountain and all the case studies, if you go study those things, they're networked. They're much more networked in their relationships. They're not vertical and they're not hierarchical. They operate in a far more networked related systems, because that's how the work actually happens.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question. We were talking to some teams, and one of the people on the team said, she was doing leadership rounds, excuse me, and we talked a little bit about this, and she said, I went to the basement and I started talking to people in environmental services and biotech and, the people who sort of are unseen, but are, the moving power really behind a healthcare organization like a hospital for sure. And they gave her an earful. They said, listen, we learn about all these decisions. We don't know where they're coming from, but they all really affect me, not just me. They affect my financial security, my family, my sense of who we are, you know, and we don't feel like we're part of it, and we don't know what to predict. We don't know how to be secure in our future. So how do you answer that? What do you say to
It's
that?
heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking. It's so unnecessary. Somebody on a floor higher than the basement leads that group. How much time are you spending down there? How much time are you just down there engaging with them, asking them how they are, asking them what they need, asking them how you can be helpful? I wish leaders would, you know, ask that one question: how can I be helpful? And then everything you all began this chat with, and then listen. This is not rocket science, but, you know, rather than advocating for more resources or more budget or advocating for things that they haven't even asked for, but you think you want, just go down and spend time with them. When people like that, you know, do I matter? Do I belong? They're telling you, I feel like I don't matter and I don't belong. They're broadcasting it. So anything else you do for them will be of no merit until you meet those fundamental needs of them feeling seen and known. Just go spend time with them and help them solve their problems. Help them solve, you know, if they don't understand how critical their work is to the clinical pathways that you're treating, help them see it. Don't leave them in the dark.
You think it really relies on physical presence, Ron? I mean, because people send out messages and all this kind of stuff.
You know, I would over-index on that to begin with. If that's where they're starting from, a place that's feeling that isolated. I mean, you know, look, our Surgeon General just released this week: isolation is our new pandemic.
Right.
Now, in virtual worlds, that the physical presence isn't easy to accomplish or not always possible. Then be there virtually. But they have to hear you say the words: how can I help? What do you need? What would make you feel connected? What would make you feel more valued? They're not going to say more money. We're so afraid of hearing that. People point to money. Yes, when you're underpaid, but people point to money as the last lever of resort when they're not getting their other needs met. We have 50 years of research that show that people are not choosing their jobs because of money is the top reason. They want meaning, they want purpose, they want contribution, they want to matter. People sure didn't choose healthcare for the money. And so give them what they're asking for. Give them a sense of meaning and purpose and care. And if that isn't something as a leader you're good at, then get good at it. Go learn. Other people are figuring this out.
It's funny because in the, I think this is a Q&A, just sort of reiterating this question about techniques for communication, sort of effective. We've talked about the in-person or virtual. Is there anything else that you want to elaborate for her?
Are you talking about Roxanne's question?
Yes.
You know, I see lots of executives in systems, all kinds of organizations, industries, not just healthcare, do skip level meetings. There's a two-edged sword there, because if you skip a level and you hear concerns, you can't address them, right? The level you skip has to address them. And so that's a dangerous sword. In this case, those managing the caregivers and direct caregivers, their worlds are so different that I think executives have to spend more time on the front lines, understanding those needs. And then don't try and circumvent your middle managers. Go back and talk to them about what you learned. Don't demean them, don't punish them, but say, this is what I'm hearing. What are you doing? If, as a senior executive, you are relying on the managers of the caregivers whose world couldn't possibly, right, have full understanding of what the caregivers are going through, even if they used to be one, you just have to know that data set is going to be highly limited.
There's some very interesting questions popping up now, Ron, in the Q&A. I think this question from Barbara is about promoting belonging at all levels. This is from a frontliner.
You know, what's interesting, what's funny about the neuroscience of belonging is we all know what a belonging cue is. Our brains automatically are looking for that. What I say to leaders is your own vulnerability is one of the first ways to make belongings, to make it safe to belong. your own your own lack of self-editing, your own acknowledgement of your mistakes, can set the table for it to be safe to belong. What I'd say to frontline workers and to Barbara, and this is hard sometimes if you have to lead this, is first of all, make sure that you belong to one another. That you and your peers are safe for each other, not in a collusive way that colludes against, but in a way that invites a hospitable, welcoming environment. I guarantee you that you have peers because of their gender, because of their race, because of their ethnic background, because of some reason feel like they have to hide. You know who the hiders are. You know who the isolated ones are. What are you doing to make them invite them in? Maybe they have invisible disabilities, but are there places where you have direct control of making people feel welcome that you can influence there? That at least sets the example for those above you. A lot of times, I'm not always I'm not surprised when I hear from executives who have a strained relationship with those below them, is they become distrusted, they become unwelcomed, and then they behave that way. They feel shame, they feel guilt, they feel confused, and they have been made to feel unwelcomed. And sometimes frontline workers want them to feel unwelcomed. And you have this vicious cycle. And so somebody has to break the ice. And so I would always want it to be a leader to say, hey, we can do better. Hey, this relationship is not where it needs to be. What do I need to do? And it's a two-way street, right? So you on the front lines may find you have to be more hospitable as well.
Right.
But if a leader doesn't initiate that conversation, I would love for someone to upwardly say, hey, come to our lunch, or hey, get to know us. Let's get to know you. Rehumanize each other, because at that point you've concocted each other. You've labeled each other, and you have to see each other as human again.
This is a combination of humble leadership and relationship-centered leadership you're talking about, Ron.
You know what? Beautifully said, Beth. And if we would just do more of that, we could move these needles so much quicker.
That's just amazing.
I understand that it's not how we're trained, and sometimes it's not natural for us, but whatever, get over it and learn it.
Yeah. I think we're going to have to close out, which is really, really a shame. I think this could go on for quite a bit longer. But I do want to
quickly get to Sarah's question about a toxic leader.
Yeah.
Let me assume that the leader doesn't know they're toxic.
Which is probably true.
I would love for the toxic leader to be gone, but a lot of times when a new leader comes in, the toxicity is still there, and so you have to detox the team to allow that new leader to thrive. I would hope if the toxic leader is there, you have HR systems, you have compliance, you have systems to enable the reporting of that. So for those of you who are looking, so Anonymous City, I hope my book might help. I think if you read To Be Honest, you'll get a few tips for your own authentic leadership to foster trust. And there's a whole bunch of, there's webinars and videos at the website, tobehonest.net. Karen, that's a hard question. Administrative decisions that cause harm, because the harm is in the eye of the beholder. And so I would say there are probably secondary indicators that are showing you that if an administrative decision caused harm to patients or caused harm to a system, there are other indicators showing that. And I hope that there are places where those can be raised.
So great. Well, folks, you can certainly return to our website for a recording of this. It should be live on our website by early next week, I think. I'm taking home many, many things: tell the truth, behave fairly, connect with the greater good, and make sure everybody feels valued and that they matter. Just so many incredible stories and take-home lessons. Julie, I'm going to turn this over to you to close us out. Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Ron and Dr. Lown. That was just an amazing conversation. And thank you to all of you who joined us today. We hope you enjoyed this Compassion in Action webinar. Please keep an eye out on your email for news of future events. And finally, please take a moment to fill out the very brief survey we'll be sending you after the webinar. We appreciate your feedback on today's session. Thank you for joining us and for your commitment to compassionate healthcare. Take care, and we hope to see you soon.